Our reading today comes from the Reverend Elizabeth Wynn, and as I was sitting in the library before service, I was thinking about what a small UU world it is, because Elizabeth and I knew each other in seminary, and I was looking at the wall of interns in your library, the pictures, and thinking, I know like half of these people. But this is my first time here, so thank you for welcoming me. But I feel like I have some connections already. So this is called There Is No Easier Way. And Elizabeth writes, I once saw a little sign carved in wood that read, "There is only the hard way." Many of us have been harmed by theology that told us suffering was a sacrifice that would bring us closer to God. Many of us were told that suffering would redeem us, even when we knew that actual redemption would have been to be free from the suffering to begin with. Many of us are only here, though, because of the sacrifices of others. So much of what is possible to carve out in this world requires some giving up, some letting go, some sacrifice. That is the truth of that little wooden sign. There is no easy way, there is only the hard way. In particular, the work of justice often asks us to do impossible, hard, terrifying things. There is no easier way, there is only this one hard way. Folks with more privilege sometimes get caught up here. If it's hard, maybe we're doing it wrong, we tell ourselves. We're lulled by our experiences of choosing between a hard choice and an easier one. Folks with less privilege know that many of our choices are between a horrific choice and a horrific choice. We learn to live with that and keep going. Many of us want to do the right thing, the just thing, the generous thing, and also not to have to give anything at all. We want to share our opinions, but not actually donate our evenings and weekends, our doing dishes while on the conference call to get to understand the work enough to be able to offer meaningful thoughts. We want people to trust us and let us shape the vision, but not actually risk inviting folks out to tea, dinner, beers, or church to build a relationship that endures and carries us forward. We may want to post the cute meme, I do that all the time, without actually making the phone call to the city councilor or state representative. We want to be part of that powerful, courageous, game-changing, direct action without the long past midnight planning meetings, the messy decision-making, the frayed relationships, the constant wondering if this is even worth it. We want to talk about being bound together in interdependence, but do not actually want to give our guest room to a stranger, give a paycheck to someone we've never met, to turn our schedule inside out to do what needs to be done. The word sacrifice might be too much mess for some of us, too tainted by oppression or coercion. What matters more is that we are willing to live our lives in the shape of what is being asked, not hope that what we are asked to do will fit the shape of our lives. And thus ends our reading. Thank you all so much for your musical offerings today. So the question I want to tackle today is, how do we do the right thing? I hear a lot of times in stories from the past that the right thing is obvious. With the gift of hindsight, we can see who was wrong and who was right so clearly. We've sanitized a lot of these civil rights stories to be that way when things were often much more complicated. Not that I'm against civil rights or anything, definitely for them. Even the outcomes of those stories are not so clear, though. I worked for a time in Natchez, Mississippi in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, and things were still actually pretty segregated. Not in the way they used to be. No, now all the white kids go to the private schools. But it's still there. So we know that it's more complicated than some simple, as Elizabeth Wynn puts it, between a good choice, a hard choice and an easier choice. It's much more complicated. Those obvious decisions are not ones we agonize over. It's the difficult ones, or the ones between two bad choices, or the new ones, or the ones where options are not clear, where there's so many choices that it's hard to even sift through them. And so this question has come up for me again and again during this pandemic, right? What's the right thing to do? We could replace right with the safe, or responsible, or compassionate, or generous, though each of those have different shades of meaning, of course. But in this time with so much unknown, so many conflicting views, many of those views not well-intentioned, it has to be said, and with things changing all the time, the answer we had 6 weeks ago is probably not the answer we'll have today. With entering into these unprecedented, if I can use that word just one more time, times, circumstances, situations, and decisions, it's not easy. Is it a question of following the science? If we can sift through all the science, is it one of balancing individuality and the community, or freedom and responsibility? Is it a question of doing what's best for me and my loved ones and letting others worry about themselves? Or in this interwoven world, is that impossible to do in any meaningful way, when a virus can circumnavigate the globe in a matter of weeks? Let's try to break it down. One way to phrase this question is, how do we know what is good? And then how do we do that? And how do we convince or compel others to do the same? The last 2 years have seen us in a very serious, high-stakes round of decision-making, I guess. What safety measures should each of us take and all of us take together? I was thinking, and it's not a perfect analogy, but stay with me for a second, that we're in a large-scale version of what's called the prisoner's dilemma. Maybe you've heard of it. It's a famous problem originally proposed by Merrill Flood and Melvin Dreschler in 1950, actually about the Cold War, which seems particularly relevant once again, doesn't it? Anyway, the thing is that there's two prisoners, and they're faced with a choice. They can both stay silent about what they have done, and they will face some punishment, or they can both blame each other, and they'll get more punishment because they'll have completely ratted each other out, of course. Or one can blame the other and probably get set free while the other serves a much longer sentence, or, of course, vice versa. And the idea is that there are consequences to the decision you make, and that if you cooperate, you can do better, but if you turn on the other person and they don't turn on you, you can do even better, right? There are incentives for both good and poor behavior. And I thought about this a lot in the context of wearing masks, frankly. It's a pretty slight inconvenience, but it is one. I don't like wearing them. It's not particularly comfortable. It's not what I would do if there was no reason to. But in order to protect others, it seems like a fair compromise. It's quite effective, not perfect, but very effective. And then there's the question of, what if some people do it but others don't? Is it really worth it at that point, or is it just, should we just scrap it? And there's a lot of science to get into. We can talk about what masks are most effective and what situations. Outside is better than inside, that sort of thing. Again, it's not a perfect analogy. Perhaps there are better ones. I'm not an expert in the field of ethics problems. Perhaps one of the many permutations of problems where you have to decide whether letting one person die and is better than a group, maybe something like that applies. The trolley problem, maybe you've heard of too. And in these last 2 years, if you didn't know beforehand, but certainly now, these are not particularly idle discussions. Our actions each and every day have real-world consequences, both for us and for others. So to explore what we should do, I want to start with what I hope is the central premise, and it might be a controversial one. It seems obvious to me, but I know that it's not easy or always true, that we should want to do good. I think it's obvious, but our world has shown us that not everyone agrees with that. This is an important theological point, not obvious one. there are often great rewards for not doing good, for harming others, right? That's essentially capitalism in a little nugget. There are great rewards for being bad to other people. So we can poke a number of holes in this question right away. And so what is good? Does it even exist in the world? What about those significant temptations and rewards of not doing good that we so often see? Okay, I'm going to skip that one because I don't know how to get into it today, actually. I'm going to assume that we all want to do good here. I don't know what that means, but we're going to go ahead to how we can figure out what is good. And there have been limitless attempts to answer this question too. There's a number of prominent schools of thought about how to determine what the good or right thing is. And now I hope that there's no ethics professors in the room, because I'm going to give brief, hopefully correct, but unavoidably oversimplified versions of a few of these. So to give a few examples, there's deontology, right? That is that we can find universal moral laws, and if we follow them, good things happen. We can figure out how to do good things. If you've ever read Kant, you have one version of this at least. The idea that we can discern certain rules. One of Kant's most famous ones, and one that really speaks to me, was to treat people always as ends, not as means. That is a very sort of a jargony way of saying don't exploit others simply for your own gain. Again, we do this quite a lot in our modern world, don't we? Exploiting others for our own gain. But I think, as Unitarian Universalists, as liberal religionists, we believe that this is how we should be doing things. There's another school that really appeals to me called consequentialism, and there's infinite versions of it. But the idea that you can know whether something is right or good by its consequences, by what happens after. Of course, you have to make a lot of mistakes to sort of figure that out, I suppose. But it has a lot of merit. In our circles, we often phrase this as impact is more important than intent. There's virtue ethics, the idea that cultivating good qualities will lead to the ability to discern and to have good behaviors. Plato, Socrates, they were espousing versions of this. There's utilitarianism. The idea, if you watch Thomas the Tank, you know all about utilitarianism. It's entirely about utilitarianism. Are you a good, productive, useful engine? The idea that we should try to do the most good and or minimize the harm to the most people, and that's what is good. Which again, sounds pretty good, though it gets very sticky when what helps a lot of people might greatly harm some. This idea can easily be used to oppress certain groups in the name of helping the common good. Our nation's very familiar with that. That's icky, to put it very mildly. There are more contemporary schools too. I'm a big fan of the philosopher Tim Scanlon. If you've watched the TV show The Good Place, you're familiar with some of his work, actually. Not only do they draw upon what he did, but they actually consulted him for some of the show. The Good Place, by the way, is a half-hour comedy, but it's wonderful. It's now off the air, but you can watch it on all the streaming services, of course. It's an excellent exploration of a lot of these ethical ideas. I recommend it wholeheartedly. Kristen Bell is excellent in it, too. They explore what it means to be good and how our actions can have complex consequences, how weighing these choices is never easy. Anyway, Scanlon's magnum opus is a book called What We Owe to Each Other. And he assumes, as the title indicates, that we do owe something to each other. That's a crucially important point. And it's one that stands in stark contrast to, I'll say it once again, capitalism, and a point that Unitarian Universalists and humanists and others have long made, that we are all linked, that it matters how we treat others. In short, that we have responsibilities, things we owe to one another. Sorry, I lost my place there for a second. Let me find it here. Okay. Scanlon argues for something called contractualism, which again is a very jargony word, but the writer Dylan Matthews, who is a student of Scanlon, defines it this way. He says, in short, the idea is that to act morally is to abide by principles that no one could reasonably reject. Like, don't kill people. Though that gets complicated quick because we might have a situation, again, as I mentioned earlier, in which that makes sense. But that is that we have a duty to each other to act in a certain way, to at least meet minimum standards. And the difficulty generally is not figuring out what these are, things like clean up after yourself or don't hurt others. The difficulty is in getting everyone else, and occasionally yourself, to follow the same rules. Our legal system is in a sense a contractual one. We and our elected representatives have made agreements about what behavior we will not accept and thereby what we will accept. Of course, there are myriad ways to flout this. You can just break laws since you often won't get caught. I'm talking to you, person who ran a red light in front of me. Or you can use your influence, often in the form of wealth, to make laws that most people don't agree with. You can look at our tax code for a slew of examples of those. We could go on and on. The influence of wealth is a huge problem in all of these systems. One way that capitalism can make difficult the right thing is through wealth and resources. The right thing can be a very different choice for someone with great means than for someone with almost nothing. Is it wrong to steal bread when you're starving? To give another classic example, I think it's complicated. If you're almost unimaginably wealthy, if you have, say, $100 billion maybe, is it wrong not to spend some or most of that to help others? I would say yes, it is wrong not to do that. But our society has much, much more mixed views on that subject, as evidenced by the fact that we don't tax out of billionaires. These questions are hugely important. I'm also a big fan, I first found him in college, of the writer-philosopher Frantz Fanon, who some decades ago pointed out that perhaps the central issue that can affect all the other issues in our society is wealth and how it's distributed. He wrote, to quote him, a short quote, "The basic confrontation which seemed to be colonialism versus anti-colonialism, capitalism versus socialism, is already losing its importance." This was more than 50 years ago. He's writing this, by the way. "What matters today, the issue which blocks the horizon, is the need for a redistribution of wealth. Humanity will have to address this question, no matter how devastating the consequences may be." Well, we haven't done that yet, and I don't see a lot of movement towards addressing it in meaningful ways. To put this a little more concrete terms, the ethicist Michael Sandel, also wonderful work, his book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, I would recommend to anyone. He makes a similar point in a way that feels much more concrete. He describes price gouging, again, very relevant, as in the price of gas going suddenly up in a crisis. Is this wrong? Is it smart business? The answer depends on a lot of things, including what our initial assumptions are about the entire situation. Is there a way to determine what a fair price is? Market systems say that whatever someone will pay is fair. But most of us, I think, reject the idea that raising the price significantly in a crisis is fair in some fundamental way that we know, even if we might struggle to describe it. Getting a lot of outside input today between thunder and bells and... All right, where was I? Sandel's answer lies in balancing the needs of the individual and community. The school of which he is usually described to be part of is called communitarianism, which appeals to me greatly too, though the criticism I have of his is, how do you make people actually care about those things? People who have significant incentives not to care about them. So the issues aren't easy, but they matter. How are we to know the right thing? So my argument today is not to tell you what the right thing is. I think that's impossible for me to do. but to tell you that you should be thinking about what the right thing is, that you can figure it out yourself. And the important thing is for us to know what sources of wisdom we're drawing upon from that. What religious sources, what community sources, how are we thinking about that in important ways? It's neither easy and usually not fun to do this work in the world. So today my point is that doing the right thing is up to each of us, but up to all of us together. Our government, our sources of wisdom, our parents, our mentors are important sources, but at best they cannot do everything for us. They may, at best they can set a minimum standard, like our laws attempt to do. The sort of minimum standards we've tried and not always successfully implemented in this pandemic. In the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of the ugly side of figuring out what is right, and even harder, trying to do it together. But we've also seen a lot of good, a lot of our fellow humans making big changes in order to protect and include others, to go to virtual worship, to wear masks when very few of us ever did that before. No one likes lockdowns or wearing masks or getting a needle stuck into you. I had a lot of convincing to do with my kids to get vaccines done, but we did. But in the right circumstances, of course, these are absolutely the right thing to do. And in most circumstances, most other circumstances for most people, they wouldn't be the right thing to do. So the right or good thing is highly contextual too. So here's where I close. Friends, we can do this. And it's in places like this congregation, where we can have nuanced, difficult conversations about important things, where we can work to determine what is right for each of us and for all of us. Maybe even we could figure out what is true, which is a whole nother question. This is the sort of place where we can begin to build the world of which we dream, one piece at a time. May it be so.